My mother looked at me and said, "We already told everyone you were arrogant and uninvited us. Do not make us liars." That was 5 weeks before my wedding. 5 weeks before my husband pulled down a projector screen during the reception, revealing a paper trail that left the tent dead silent. My parents claimed they boycotted the wedding to teach me humility. In truth, they were terrified I would not sign documents pinning their embezzlement scheme on me. My name is Millie Green. I am 31 years old, and I coordinate operations at Redline Medical Transit in Tennessee. My entire professional life revolves around managing chaos. I map out routes for emergency transport, I balance schedules for dozens of drivers, and I navigate crises when life support machines decide to glitch at 2 in the morning. I am a professional problem solver. But there is absolutely nothing professional, and no viable solution, for the manufactured disaster standing in front of me in the gravel parking lot of a local steakhouse on a freezing Tuesday evening. The air was bitter and sharp. It was the kind of chill that bypassed your skin and settled directly into your bones. My mother, Pamela Green, pulled the lapels of her expensive camel coat tight across her chest. She did not look angry, and honestly, that was the most terrifying part of this entire encounter. She looked entirely at peace with the devastating bomb she had just casually dropped into the conversation. "We already told the extended family," my mother said. Her voice was smooth, highly practiced, and devoid of any maternal warmth. "We told Aunt May, we told all the cousins, and we told our friends at the church that you have been increasingly disrespectful lately. We told them that you are embarrassed by your roots. We told them you uninvited us from your own wedding." I stood frozen, staring at her. The harsh, artificial glare of the parking lot lights cast long, distorted shadows over her perfectly styled hair. I tried to process the absolute fiction falling from her lips. "I never uninvited you," I said, my voice shaking just a fraction before I stabilized it. "You told me you had a scheduling conflict with the new date. A date I was forced to change because your florist suddenly canceled our deposit without telling me." "Do not split hairs, Millie," she sighed heavily. She waved a perfectly manicured hand in the air, a gesture meant to swat away my logic as if it were an annoying insect. "The point is, you need to learn. You have grown far too big for your boots since you got engaged. We are doing this to teach you humility. Teach you humility." She wore that specific phrase like a luxury designer label. It was her favorite moral shield. But her tone was pure, unyielding steel. It was not a lesson. It was a command. Bow your head. Fall in line. Know your place in the hierarchy. Growing up in the Green household, I was always the reliable, invisible daughter. The one who stayed strictly in the background while my younger sister Blair sparkled in the spotlight as the golden child. I was not supposed to have boundaries. Changing my wedding schedule was a basic logistical necessity, but to Pamela and my father, Russell, it had been escalated into a massive war of honor, a direct challenge to their absolute authority. Just 10 feet away, leaning casually against the passenger side of our sedan, stood Nolan Pierce, my soon-to-be husband. Nolan was a title searcher for Crown Ledger Title and Escrow. He spent his days hunting down hidden liens, uncovering buried deeds, and tracking paper trails that desperate people tried very hard to erase. He possessed a quiet, observant intensity. He did not rush in to save me from my mother. He knew I needed to stand my ground, but his eyes never once left my parents. He was calculating the scene. He was watching the performance unfold with the trained eye of an investigator. My mother took a deliberate step closer to me. She reached deep into her oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. Without warning, she shoved it firmly against my chest. Instinctively, I brought both my hands up to catch it before it fell into the dirt. "Just sign it for me," she said. Her voice suddenly dropped its theatrical, victimized edge and became completely brisk and businesslike. "It is just a formality. The June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship needs to update its board registry before the annual gala next month. It is standard state compliance. Just a few signatures. Page 3 and page 7. I put sticky tabs on the exact lines. I looked down at the bulky envelope resting in my cold hands. The flap was completely unsealed. I slid my thumb under the edge, pulled out the top sheet of crisp white paper, and tilted it toward the dim overhead street lamp. It was indeed a state compliance form for a charitable foundation. My eyes scanned the neatly arranged boxes. Then, my breath caught in my throat. I stopped reading. Right there, typed in bold black ink under the executive committee section, was my name, Millie Green. And directly next to my name, the official title, Treasurer. "I am not the treasurer," I said, my voice going tight and defensive. "I have never been the treasurer of the foundation. I do not even attend the board meetings. I have never seen a single ledger." "It is just a title," Pamela snapped back, instantly losing a fraction of her carefully manufactured patience. "It keeps the foundation structure strictly within the family. Stop making every single little thing so incredibly difficult." Before I could shove the stack of papers back into her hands, my father stepped out from the deep shadows of his luxury sport utility vehicle. Russell Green was a large man who used his physical presence like a blunt weapon. He stopped right beside my mother, looming over the conversation, casting an even darker shadow over me. "Here is the bottom line," my father said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that demanded immediate submission. "You are going to move the wedding back to the original weekend. You are going to sign the paperwork tonight to help your family. And you are going to apologize to your mother for this ridiculous, rebellious phase you are currently going through. If you do not cooperate with us right now, we will not be at that wedding. We will not pay another dime toward the catering or the venue. You will be entirely on your own, and everyone in this town will know exactly why." I looked from his hardened face to hers. They presented a completely united front. The sudden realization hit me like a physical blow. This was not about the wedding flowers. It was never about the catering schedule. It was about pure, unadulterated control. They were backing me into a corner to see if I would still fold. I slid the paper back into the manila envelope. I did not argue with them. I did not cry. I was far too exhausted for tears. Working 50-hour weeks at Redline while trying to salvage a wedding that felt like it was constantly crumbling underneath my feet had drained every last ounce of my emotional reserves. I assumed this was just another one of their classic, heavy-handed pressure tactics, a twisted psychological game to squeeze me until I broke down and gave them exactly what they demanded. "Good night," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward Nolan. The loud crunch of my heavy boots on the gravel sounded deafening in the quiet night air. I pulled open the car door and slid into the passenger seat, dropping the heavy manila envelope squarely onto the center console between the two front seats. Nolan got into the driver's side and closed his door, shutting out the biting wind. He did not reach for the ignition key right away. He simply sat there in the dark, looking out the windshield at my parents, who were now climbing into their pristine vehicle, looking incredibly satisfied with themselves. The silence in the car was thick and heavy. Then, Nolan slowly lowered his gaze to the envelope sitting between us. The faint amber glow from the dashboard illuminated his sharp, focused features. He reached out, his long fingers lightly tapping the thick paper. He did not look angry. He looked highly alert. "Do not sign anything," Nolan said. His voice dropped to a low, serious whisper, completely devoid of any lightheartedness. "Do not sign a single page of that until I read it. To understand how a mother and father could look their eldest daughter in the eye and threaten to ruin her wedding over a charity compliance form, you have to understand Ridgeway, Tennessee. Growing up in Ridgeway meant knowing exactly where you stood in the social ecosystem. The Green family stood near the very top of that pyramid. We were the kind of respectable folks who occupied the third pew from the front at the First Presbyterian Church every single Sunday morning. My father, Russell, shook hands and closed lucrative property deals at the local Chamber of Commerce meetings, while my mother, Pamela, organized the seasonal bake sales, the holiday clothing drives, and the summer literacy campaigns. They were the undisputed pillars of the community. They painstakingly built and fiercely protected the image of the perfect model American family. But behind the heavy custom-carved oak front door of our sprawling colonial home, things operated vastly differently. Our household was not a place of unconditional love, spontaneous laughter, or warm, messy affection. It was a strict corporate hierarchy masquerading as a family unit. Every action was measured, every word was evaluated for its public relations value, and love was an allowance doled out only when you successfully met your performance metrics. In this family corporation, my younger sister Blair was the undisputed face of the franchise. Blair was born with a natural magnetic charm and an instinct for working a crowd. She had the bright, photogenic smile that looked absolutely perfect in the local newspaper when she was handed oversized novelty checks to present to community centers. My parents cultivated her talents with military precision. They dressed her in the right designer clothes, sent her to the right elite summer camps, and pushed her to the physical front of every family photograph. She was articulate, bubbly, and entirely willing to play the game they designed for her. I was completely different. I was not openly abused. I was never struck, and I was never locked in a closet, which made the psychological weight I carried so incredibly hard to explain to outsiders who only saw our perfect lawn. I was simply positioned as the reliable, low-maintenance asset. I was the child who did not need special attention, the one who quietly fixed her own problems, did her homework without being asked, and stayed safely out of the spotlight. When you are constantly praised for being invisible, you learn to shrink yourself. I grew up swallowing my emotions whole, pushing down my own needs until they became a dull, permanent ache residing deep in my chest. I became the logistical backbone of my own life because no one else was going to support me. Whenever I tried to assert a boundary, whenever I expressed a desire that did not align perfectly with the Green family master plan, the pushback was swift and distinctly moralistic. My mother possessed a terrifying genius for weaponizing virtue. If I wanted to spend Thanksgiving break with my college roommates, instead of attending a dry, suffocating networking dinner masquerading as a family meal, she would look at me with profound, devastating disappointment. She would tell me I was acting selfishly. She would say I lacked humility. That specific word was her ultimate tool of control. Humility did not mean being modest or grounded. In Pamela Green's dictionary, humility meant erasing yourself to make room for her ego. It was an invisible electric fence. Every time I hit it, I got shocked back into my designated quiet corner. That is why falling in love with Nolan felt like breathing pure oxygen for the very first time in my 31 years of life. He did not ask me to perform. He never expected me to manage his emotions or shrink my own capabilities to make him look taller. Nolan proposed to me exactly 14 months ago. He did not do it at a fancy, Michelin-starred restaurant with a hidden photographer waiting in the wings, and he certainly did not do it at a loud Green family gathering. He took me to a restored, rustic farm venue out in the neighboring county. We walked through rows of ancient apple trees under a cool, clear twilight sky. The air smelled of burning wood smoke and damp, fertile earth. There was no audience clapping for us. There was no carefully curated aesthetic designed for social media validation. He just stopped walking, took both of my cold hands in his warm ones, and asked me to build a real, honest life with him. It was a moment so intensely private, so deeply warm and secure, that I finally understood what a true, equal partnership looked like. It was the absolute antithesis of everything I had ever known under my parents' roof. I foolishly believed my parents might share just a fraction of that joy when we drove back to Ridgeway to tell them the news. I walked into their pristine, dust-free living room, the diamond ring catching the harsh light from their expensive crystal chandeliers. I smiled so hard my cheeks physically hurt. There were no tears of happiness. There were no warm, congratulatory embraces. My mother barely even glanced at the ring on my finger. My father did not bother to stand up from his leather armchair to shake Nolan's hand. Pamela immediately crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her brow furrowing in deep, calculating thought. Her very first question, delivered before she even offered a hollow, obligatory congratulations, hit me like a sudden splash of ice water. She looked me dead in the eye and asked if the wedding date we had in mind was going to conflict with the annual fundraising gala for the June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship. The June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship was the absolute crown jewel of my parents' public relations empire. Named in honor of my late paternal grandmother, the foundation supposedly provided generous grants and tuition assistance to local kids looking to attend vocational schools. My parents talked about the foundation constantly to anyone who would listen. It was their ultimate, undeniable proof of civic virtue. Whenever they needed to win a public argument, secure a business permit, or deflect any kind of local criticism, they immediately brought up the scholarship. For my entire life, I genuinely believed it was a noble, beautiful cause. I thought it was the one truly selfless, pure thing my family did for the working-class kids in our county who desperately needed a leg up in life. I quickly assured her that our chosen Saturday in late October was entirely clear of her foundation events. I told her we were planning a simple, beautiful evening ceremony. They nodded stiffly, mentally checking a box on their invisible clipboards, and the conversation swiftly moved on to discussing how Blair would look as the maid of honor and what color dress she should wear. I left their house that night feeling a very familiar, hollow ache in my stomach, but I stubbornly brushed it off. I told myself it was just their way. I told myself they were just busy, important people focused on their vital charity work. I made excuses for their coldness, just like I had done every day since I was a child. I was so incredibly naive. I had absolutely no idea that the specific weekend we had chosen for our wedding carried a hidden, ticking time bomb. I did not know that late October was not just the beautiful season for changing leaves and rustic farm weddings in Tennessee. I was completely, blissfully unaware that the State Registry of Charitable Organizations had officially scheduled a comprehensive, mandatory financial audit of the June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship for the exact Monday morning following our wedding weekend. I did not know the foundation was quietly bleeding thousands of dollars. I did not know the accounting books were meticulously cooked, and I certainly did not know that my parents were frantically searching for a credible, unsuspecting scapegoat to take the devastating fall before the state auditors knocked on their heavy oak door. That impending audit was the true, terrifying reason they were losing their minds over my wedding schedule. It was never about my attitude, it was never about disrespect, and it was never about teaching me humility. It was about their own survival, and they were more than willing to entirely sacrifice my future to guarantee theirs. The ringing of my phone cut through the quiet hum of the dispatch center like a siren. It was Thursday afternoon. I had just finished rerouting 3 ambulances around a massive pileup on Interstate 40 when my father's name flashed on my personal cell screen. I stepped into the narrow, windowless break room to take it. "Millie," Russell said. No greeting. No warmth, just the heavy, authoritative weight of a man accustomed to blind obedience. "Your mother and I have discussed this at length. We are giving you one final opportunity to fix this mess. Move the wedding date back. If you refuse, we will not be attending. We are doing this so you learn to respect the family." "Dad, I cannot just move it," I whispered, pressing the heel of my hand against my forehead. "The venue is booked. The invitations are out." "That is a logistical problem, not a moral one," he replied instantly. "You made this bed. Now you fix it. Let us know when you have come to your senses." He hung up. The line went dead. My phone immediately vibrated again. A text from my mother. "Did you sign the paperwork yet?" "It is just a routine board update before the gala. Drop it off at the house tonight." She had sent identical messages every morning and every evening since the parking lot incident. That night, sitting at the small laminate kitchen table in the apartment I shared with Nolan, I finally slid the papers completely out of the manila envelope. The apartment was quiet. Nolan was in the bedroom, folding a mountain of laundry. I flattened the thick cream-colored pages under the harsh overhead light. I read the first page, then the second. I skipped to the signature line Pamela had flagged with a bright yellow sticky note. My breath hitched. I looked closer at the top right corner of the document. The effective date typed on the official state filing was not this month. It was not last month. The document was meticulously backdated to exactly 8 months ago, February the 12th. According to these pages, I had been the acting financial director, the treasurer, of the June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship for 3/4 of a year. I was listed as the primary signatory on the foundation's banking accounts. My hands began to shake. I picked up my phone and dialed my mother. She answered on the first ring, sounding entirely too eager. "Did you sign them?" she asked. "Why is this backdated to February?" I demanded, my voice rising in the quiet kitchen. "Mom, this says I have been managing the foundation's money for 8 months. I do not even know what bank the charity uses." There was a sharp, calculating pause on the other end of the line. When Pamela spoke again, her tone was slick with practiced condescension. "Formalities are formalities, Millie," she sighed, exasperated. The previous treasurer had to step down suddenly, and we needed a family member on the roster to maintain our tax status. We just forgot to file the paperwork at the time. "It is a simple administrative correction. You cannot just retroactively make me the treasurer of a charity," I said. "Oh, please," she snapped, dropping the sweet act entirely. "Do not act so dramatic. You have changed so much since you started dating Nolan. He is turning you against your own blood. He is making you paranoid and difficult. Just sign the paper and stop tearing this family apart." She ended the call before I could respond. The real punishment began 2 days later. I was in the middle of a brutal 12-hour shift at Redline. My desk was buried in transit manifests when my phone rang. It was the owner of the local bakery we had hired for the reception. "Millie, I'm so sorry to bother you," the baker said, her voice tight with uncomfortable hesitation. "But I just got a call from your mother. She canceled the cake order. She requested a full refund of the deposit, and since the initial payment was processed on her credit card, I had to comply." My stomach dropped into my shoes. "She canceled it?" "Yes. She said the wedding was indefinitely postponed." Before I could even process the loss of the bakery, an email notification popped up on my screen. It was from our florist. The message was brief and painfully polite, stating that Pamela Green had withdrawn her financial backing for the floral arrangements and the contract was now null and void. I sat frozen in my ergonomic office chair, the chaotic noise of the dispatch center fading into a dull roar. They were systematically dismantling my wedding. Because Pamela had generously offered to put down the initial retainers as a gift months ago. Her name was on the contracts. She had the legal right to pull the plug, and she was doing it with surgical precision. I called Nolan on my dinner break. I was hyperventilating behind a row of parked ambulances. He left work early, picked me up, and we sat in his car in the Redline parking lot. "They pulled the money," I choked out, tears of sheer frustration finally spilling over. "The cake, the flowers, probably the caterer next. We have nothing left. We cannot afford to replace all those deposits right now." Nolan gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. He did not curse. He did not yell. He just looked at me with an anchor of absolute calm. "Then we do it ourselves," he said firmly. "We do not need their money. We do not need their vendors. We will pivot. We will build it from scratch." The next 3 weeks were a waking nightmare of exhaustion. I picked up every single overtime shift I could grab at Redline Medical Transit, coordinating oxygen deliveries and dialysis transports until my eyes burned. I needed the extra time and a half pay just to afford basic folding chairs and cheap bulk greenery. I would finish a 14-hour shift, drive home in the dark, and sit on the living room floor with Nolan. We slashed our guest list by 60%. We found a community center that rented plain white tablecloths for $2 each. I bought yards of inexpensive tulle and faux eucalyptus from a craft store, piecing it all together with fabric glue and finger protectors at 2 o'clock in the morning. I was running on empty. I was physically hollowed out. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life. Then, late one Tuesday night, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. A single text message from my father. I opened it. The screen glared in the dark room. "If you choose pride over family, do not expect the family to protect you." It was so cold, It was devoid of any parental emotion. It read like a threat from a corporate mob boss. I stared at the words until they blurred together. Nolan walked into the living room, carrying 2 mugs of cheap instant coffee. He set them down, his eyes falling on the glowing screen of my phone. He read the text. Then, he turned his attention to the coffee table, where the manila envelope still sat, exactly where I had abandoned it days ago. He sat down on the edge of the sofa. He reached out and pulled the thick stack of papers onto his lap. "I need to read this," he said quietly. "Every single word?" I watched him. For 30 straight minutes, the only sound in the apartment was the rustling of thick paper and the heavy ticking of the wall clock. Nolan's eyes tracked back and forth across the dense legal jargon. He flipped to the back, checked the state codes referenced in the footnotes, and cross-referenced the dates. When he finally looked up, his face was completely drained of color. The quiet intensity in his eyes made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Millie," he said, his voice dropping into a register I had never heard before. "This is not a board update. This is an indemnity clause disguised as a corporate filing." He tapped a specific paragraph buried on page 6. "By signing this, you are not just accepting the title of treasurer. You are retroactively signing off on 8 months of financial ledgers. You are legally stating that you reviewed and approved every single dollar that moved in and out of the June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship since February." He looked straight into my eyes, and the sheer gravity of his words anchored me to the floor. "If this is real," Nolan whispered, "they are trying to attach the Foundation's financial liability to you." The assault did not begin with a loud confrontation. It started as a subtle, suffocating trickle of notifications that quickly turned into a flood. By Wednesday morning, my phone was vibrating off the surface of my desk at the dispatch center every 5 minutes. I opened a message from my cousin Sarah. It read that she could not believe I banned my own mother and father from seeing me walk down the aisle and that I should be ashamed of myself. 10 minutes later, a text from Uncle David arrived. He wrote that everyone knew Nolan made good money now, but acting like I was too good for the people who raised me was just cold. He told me to remember my roots. They all used the exact same phrases. Ashamed. Banned. Roots. It was a perfectly synchronized choir singing a song my parents had meticulously composed. In a town like Ridgeway, gossip is the primary currency, and my parents were spending it lavishly to buy public sympathy. The killing blow landed in the massive Green family group chat, a digital gathering space with over 40 relatives. My father, playing the role of the weary, wounded patriarch to absolute perfection, posted a lengthy paragraph right before the lunch hour. He wrote that Pamela and he were absolutely heartbroken to announce that they would not be attending the wedding next month. He claimed I had made it abundantly clear that I no longer wished to associate with their side of the family. He said that while my decision to exclude them cut them to the bone, they had to respect my boundaries as an adult. He finished by asking everyone to send me love and to refrain from judging me during this clearly difficult transitional phase of my life. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. He managed to play the victim, paint me as the ruthless aggressor, and simultaneously ask for pity, all while making sure every aunt, uncle, and second cousin knew I was the one who supposedly severed the ties. I wanted to scream. I wanted to type out a blistering, multi-paragraph response exposing the charity documents and the blackmail. But before my trembling thumbs could hit the keyboard, Nolan called me. "Do not reply to the family group," Nolan said immediately. "Do not say a single word. You need to listen to something my mother just sent me." Nolan's mother, Evelyn Pierce, was a retired county court reporter. She had spent 35 years sitting quietly in the corner of tense courtrooms, transcribing the exact lies desperate people told under oath. She possessed a built-in radar for deception. Pamela had grossly underestimated her. Nolan played an audio file over the phone. It was a recorded phone call between my mother and Evelyn from earlier that morning. "Evelyn, dear." My mother's voice cooed through the speaker, dripping with a sickeningly sweet, artificial concern. "I am just calling because Russell and I are terribly worried about Millie. She is going through some sort of severe emotional crisis. She is completely unbalanced right now. We are stepping back from the wedding because we are terrified she might cause a massive public scandal. We just want to make sure Nolan knows what he is getting into. Evelyn did not miss a beat. Her recorded response was sharp, flat, and professional. Millie seems incredibly grounded to me. Pamela, Evelyn replied smoothly, especially considering the amount of stress she has been put under recently. If there is a scandal brewing, I am quite certain it is not coming from her end of the aisle. The recording clicked off. My mom knew exactly what she was trying to do, Nolan said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Evelyn told me to tell you this right now. From this second forward, you do not answer a phone call from your parents. You do not speak to them in person. You force every single piece of communication into text messages or emails. You build a paper trail. I thought the character assassination was confined to the family tree. I was wrong. The campaign breached the walls of my professional life less than 24 hours later. My supervisor at Redline Medical Transit, a pragmatic woman named Sarah, who usually only cared about route efficiency and response times, called me into her glass-walled office. She closed the blinds. She did not look at me with anger, but with a deep, unsettling pity. Millie, Sarah started gently, folding her hands on her desk. I received a very strange phone call this morning. It was from your mother. The blood drained from my face. I gripped the armrests of the chair to keep my hands from shaking. I am not going to disclose the full details of the conversation, Sarah continued, her tone strictly professional but laced with a quiet warning. But she suggested that you are currently experiencing a severe mental breakdown. She heavily implied that putting you in charge of emergency dispatch coordinates right now might be a huge liability for the company. I felt the air get sucked out of the room. My parents were not just trying to isolate me socially. They were actively trying to sabotage my livelihood. They were trying to get me fired. Sarah, I swear to you, I stammered, my chest tightening. I am perfectly capable. I am just dealing with a family dispute. I know you are, Sarah said softly. Your performance metrics are flawless. You have not missed a single beat. I told her that Redline does not discuss employee performance with outside parties, and I hung up. But Millie, I am telling you this as a friend. Your family is actively trying to destroy your professional reputation. You need to watch your back. I walked out of Sarah's office feeling entirely hollowed out. The sheer scale of their cruelty was breathtaking. They were constructing a bomb, and they were placing it directly under every foundational pillar of my life. That evening, as I sat on my living room floor tying tiny ribbons around cheap, bulk-ordered wedding favors, my phone buzzed again. It was a private number. I almost ignored it, remembering Evelyn's advice, but something compelled me to answer. Millie, it is Aunt May. Aunt May Klein was my mother's older sister. She was the black sheep of the family who moved to the other side of the state 20 years ago and rarely attended the holiday dinners. Aunt May, I exhaled, bracing myself for another lecture about family loyalty. Listen to me carefully, she said, her voice low and rushed. I am not buying a single word of the garbage your parents are selling. Pamela called me yesterday. She recited a whole script about you losing your mind and cutting them off. Then I called your cousin Greg, and he told me Russell gave him the exact same speech, almost word for word. I closed my eyes, leaning my head back against the sofa. I told her they were telling everyone the same thing. It is a smear campaign, May confirmed bluntly. They are laying groundwork. I do not know what kind of trouble Russell and Pamela are in, but I know how my sister operates. She only goes on the offensive like this when she is terrified of being exposed. Whatever you have on them, you hold on to it. The puzzle pieces suddenly snapped together with terrifying clarity. It hit me with the force of a freight train. The rumors, the group chat messages, the call to Evelyn, the attempt to get me fired at Redline. None of this was a random tantrum over a wedding invitation. It was a highly calculated, preemptive strike. If the state auditors uncovered the missing money in the June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship next month, my parents needed a fall guy. They had already forged my name as the foundation's treasurer. But if I denied it, it would be their word against mine. unless they successfully painted me as a crazy, vindictive, estranged daughter first. If everyone in town believed I was emotionally unstable, bitter, and holding a massive grudge against my generous, community-serving parents, then any accusation I made about forged signatures and stolen charity funds would just sound like the wild ravings of a lunatic daughter trying to ruin her family out of spite. They were destroying my credibility so that when the financial bomb detonated, nobody would believe a single word I said. I looked at the thick manila envelope sitting on my coffee table. It was no longer just a piece of annoying paperwork. It was the only shield I had left. A strange icy calm washed over me. The panic evaporated, replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. I was done crying over canceled cake orders. I was done trying to figure out why my mother did not love me enough to protect me. I picked up my phone, opened the family group chat, and turned off the notifications. I did not type a rebuttal. I did not call my father to beg for a truce. I refused to play the chaotic role they had scripted for me. I would stay completely, utterly silent. I would keep my head down. I would hold on to the fraudulent documents, and I would continue building my wedding from the ground up. Let them think they had won the public relations war. The truth did not care about small-town gossip, and the truth was safely locked inside a drawer in my apartment, waiting for the exact right moment to see the light of day. Nolan cleared off our small, scratched dining table, carefully pushing aside the cheap spools of ribbon and the artificial eucalyptus branches I had been hot gluing for hours. He laid out the contents of the manila envelope under the stark, unforgiving glare of the overhead kitchen light bulb. Beside those crisp, cream-colored pages, he placed a thick cardboard folder containing our current apartment lease and the mortgage pre-approval paperwork we had painstakingly filled out the previous year. Nolan did not hack into secure mainframes or break into locked filing cabinets. His daily job at the title and escrow company involved methodically hunting down discrepancies in property lines, uncovering hidden tax liens, and exposing forged deeds. He possessed an eye meticulously trained to catch the quiet, administrative lies that desperate people thought were invisible. He instructed me to look closely, tapping his index finger at the bottom of page 4 of my mother's charity filing. There was a small, designated line meant for the acting treasurer's initials, legally indicating approval of the attached financial bylaws. I leaned in close, my chest tightening with every breath. The letters inked on the line were an M and a G. I stated that it was absolutely not my handwriting. I pointed out that the loops on the M were completely wrong, heavily slanted to the right, and I never, under any circumstances, connected my initials when signing official documents. Nolan silently slid our apartment lease over the table. He pointed to my actual initials inked on the bottom margin of the rental agreement. The difference was glaring and undeniable. My mother, or perhaps my father, had boldly attempted to replicate my handwriting, but they had rushed the execution. It was a sloppy, arrogant forgery, but it was just convincing enough to pass a casual, routine glance by an overworked clerk sitting at a state registration office. The physical evidence of their betrayal did not stop there. The very next morning, while sitting at my dispatch desk during a rare quiet moment, I received a highly confusing email notification on my cell phone. When the local florist had abruptly canceled our wedding contract at my mother's aggressive demand, the shop owner had accidentally forwarded me the entire billing thread instead of just sending a standard, clean cancellation notice. I had not bothered to read it closely at the time, assuming it was just painful administrative jargon that I did not have the emotional capacity to process. Nolan, however, read absolutely everything. That evening, he asked me to open the email thread on his laptop screen. He scrolled deliberately past the heated, demanding exchange between the florist and Pamela, going right down to the original digital receipt generated from when the initial deposit was first processed 6 months prior. He told me to read the billing name attached to the payment method. I squinted at the glowing screen. The payment had not been drawn from a personal credit card belonging to Pamela Green. It had not come from a joint checking account belonging to my father. The account name listed on the receipt clearly read, June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship. A wave of cold dread settled heavily in the pit of my stomach. making me feel physically ill. The foundation was explicitly chartered to provide tuition assistance for local students entering welding programs, nursing certifications, and plumbing apprenticeships. There was absolutely no legal or ethical universe where a vocational charity had a valid reason to pay $2,000 for bridal bouquets and decorative wedding arches. My parents were not just controlling my wedding, they were illegally using tax-exempt charitable funds as their own personal checking account, and then weaponizing that stolen money against me. We desperately needed a deeper, clearer look at the whole picture. Nolan picked up his phone and called his mother. Sitting at her own kitchen table across town, Evelyn calmly guided us through the labyrinth of state public records. She explained, with the seasoned patience of a former court reporter, that we did not need to hire an expensive private investigator. Fraud of this arrogant nature usually hides in plain sight, buried under mountains of boring, unexamined bureaucratic filings. Following Evelyn's precise, step-by-step instructions, Nolan accessed the Secretary of State's online registry for charitable organizations. He typed in the foundation's official registration number. He pulled up the most recent annual board roster, a document officially submitted to the state government just 3 weeks ago. There it was, officially codified in the public domain for anyone to see. My name, Millie Green, was proudly listed as the sole treasurer of the foundation. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I had never attended a single board meeting in my entire life. I had never held a physical ledger. I did not know the password to the accounting software, and I had never once set foot inside the bank branch where the charity kept its funds. Yet, according to the state government, I was the executive officer legally responsible for safeguarding every single penny of that money. Nolan dug even deeper into the digital archives. He downloaded the foundation's publicly available tax forms, specifically the Form 990 that every nonprofit organization is legally required to file. He skipped past the noble mission statements and the polished marketing jargon, scrolling straight down to the itemized financial disbursements. He muttered that they were legally required to list major grants, his eyes darting quickly across the columns of numbers. He found a section labeled as Emergency Vocational Support Grants. He highlighted 3 separate disbursements made over the past 8 months. The amounts were staggering. $5,000 on one line, $8,000 on another, $12,000 in a single massive wire transfer. But the recipients listed were not local students struggling to pay for trade school tuition. The money had been dispersed to limited liability companies. One entity was named BG Style Consulting Limited Liability Company. The other was registered as Greenway Property Holdings. I felt the blood roaring in my ears, a loud rushing sound that drowned out the hum of the refrigerator. BG stood for Blair Green. My younger sister had recently opened a boutique styling business, catering to wealthy clients in the next county over. And Greenway Property Holdings was the exact legal name of the commercial real estate firm my father operated out of a strip mall downtown. I stated, the words tasting like dry ash in my mouth, that they were funneling the charity money directly into their own personal businesses. Nolan immediately opened a new tab on his internet browser, navigating smoothly to the county clerk's public judgment index. He searched my father's full name and the Greenway business entity. It took him less than 4 minutes to find the devastating missing piece of the puzzle. He commanded me to look at the dates, pointing firmly at the center of the screen. Late last year, the State Department of Revenue had filed 2 massive tax liens against Russell's real estate business for severely delinquent corporate taxes. The business had been quietly drowning in massive debt. The dates those specific tax liens were suddenly settled and legally released perfectly matched the exact dates the massive emergency grants were wired out of the June Green charity account. My father had brazenly used his deceased mother's charitable foundation to bail out his failing commercial enterprise. And my mother had used the same fund to finance Blair's expensive vanity project. The truth was no longer a vague, emotional suspicion. It was a solid, undeniable architecture of financial fraud. They had stolen the money, but my parents were not stupid. They knew they could not hide the missing funds forever. They needed a credible fall guy. They needed someone who looked incredibly guilty on official paper. That was the entire terrifying purpose of the backdated document Pamela had shoved into my chest in that freezing restaurant parking lot. They desperately wanted my signature to legally bind me to the treasurer role retroactively, covering the exact 8-month window when the money had been illegally siphoned out. They were meticulously setting me up to take the devastating criminal charge for their own embezzlement. I asked Nolan, my voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of profound rage and sheer terror, why there was such a sudden, aggressive rush. I asked why they were forcing this exact issue right before the wedding, turning it into a massive, destructive public spectacle. Nolan pulled up the final document Evelyn had sent over to our inbox. It was a public calendar exported directly from the State Attorney General's Charity Oversight Division. He said it was because of this, his voice entirely grim and devoid of any comforting warmth. He highlighted a specific date bolded on the state's public auditing schedule. The June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship was officially slated for a comprehensive mandatory financial compliance check. The state auditors were scheduled to arrive and demand full, unrestricted access to the foundation's bank records, receipts, and board minutes. I looked closely at the highlighted date on the screen. The breath completely left my lungs in a sharp, painful rush, leaving me dizzy. The state audit was strictly scheduled for the Monday morning immediately following our wedding weekend. The absolute clarity of the betrayal hit me so hard I could barely breathe. I grabbed my car keys off the kitchen counter, my hands shaking violently. I wanted to drive straight to my parents' house. I wanted to kick the heavy oak door open, throw the forged documents onto their pristine hardwood floor, and scream until my voice gave out. I wanted to watch the smug, self-righteous masks fall off their faces. Nolan stepped in front of the door, gently but firmly catching my wrist. He did not raise his voice, but the steady, unyielding pressure of his hand anchored me to the floor. He told me to stop and think. He reminded me that walking into their house right now, fueled only by raw emotion, was exactly how I would lose the entire war. Russell Green was a master manipulator. My father made a highly lucrative living out of twisting facts, intimidating adversaries, and rewriting reality in real time. Nolan warned me that if I confronted them tonight, my father would effortlessly spin my anger into a hysterical breakdown. He would gaslight me, tell me I was misinterpreting standard administrative procedures, and immediately begin covering his tracks before I could secure the physical proof. We needed a bulletproof case, not an emotional screaming match. I dropped my keys. The cold metal clattered against the linoleum floor. He was right. Anger was a luxury I could not afford right now. I needed strategy. The psychological depth of their trap became even more terrifying the very next afternoon. I was on my lunch break, sitting in my car behind the dispatch center, when Aunt May called me. Her voice was hushed, as if she were worried someone might overhear her from across the state. She told me she had just attended a church luncheon with several women from Ridgeway. Pamela had been holding court at a corner table, playing the role of the endlessly forgiving mother. May repeated the exact sentence my mother had confidently broadcasted to the entire room. Pamela had smiled and said that after the wedding, I would finally mature, step up, and handle the foundation's finances like a true member of the family. My blood ran completely cold. That single, carefully planted sentence illuminated the entire architecture of their master plan. The sudden boycott, the relentless emotional blackmail, and the extreme pressure to sign the backdated forms were only the first half of the trap. The second half was the wedding itself. They fully intended to break me down, force me to sign the papers in secret, and then graciously show up at my reception. They would hug me in front of 200 guests. They would pose for professional photographs, smiling warmly beside the daughter they had just framed for felony embezzlement. They would use those very pictures, and the public narrative of our touching family reconciliation, to legitimize my fake role. If the state auditors ever questioned my involvement, my parents would simply point to the wedding. They would claim I was a deeply involved, happily participating family treasurer. My own wedding was meant to be the public relations event that sealed my criminal liability. The universe, however, has a strange way of balancing the scales. The final, damning piece of evidence did not come from a public database. It arrived in a plain, unmarked brown envelope shoved into my apartment mailbox 2 days later. There was no return address. Inside the envelope was a thick stack of printed spreadsheets and a single, handwritten sticky note. The note was brief. It simply stated that the sender was a former part-time accountant who had quit the foundation 6 months ago because the work environment was impossible, and the math was severely compromised. I spread the papers across the living room rug. The anonymous whistleblower had provided copies of 2 entirely different financial ledgers for the June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship. The first stack was the donor-facing ledger. This was the pristine, beautifully formatted fiction they presented to wealthy benefactors and community leaders. It was filled with noble line items categorized as student support initiatives, emergency textbook funds, and vocational equipment grants. The second stack was the internal operating ledger. This was the raw, unedited truth. I compared the 2 sets of books line by line. The discrepancy was not a clerical error. It was a systematic, calculated looting operation. Whenever the public ledger claimed a specific amount was spent on student support, the exact same dollar amount on the exact same date appeared in the internal ledger under completely different categories. The money had actually been spent on luxury event catering, high-end brand consulting, and massive upfront commercial lease payments. One specific line item made me feel physically sick. A massive withdrawal, boldly labeled on the public documents as a youth apprenticeship program, was clearly identified on the secret internal ledger. It was 6 months of prepaid commercial rent for Blair's newly opened styling boutique. They were using money meant for kids who could barely afford welding tools to pay for my sister's vanity project in an upscale shopping district. I grabbed my phone and dialed Blair's number. She answered on the 3rd ring. Her tone was instantly defensive and sharp, heavily laced with the exact same victimhood our mother had perfected. She immediately accused me of attacking the family reputation. She demanded to know why I was being so difficult, complaining that our mother was crying in the kitchen every single day because of my unbelievable selfishness. I did not yell. I kept my voice terrifyingly calm. I cut through her practiced monologue and read the exact dates and the exact dollar amounts of the rent payments deposited into the leasing account for her boutique. I asked her how, exactly, selling overpriced designer clothes qualified as a youth apprenticeship program under a tax-exempt vocational charity. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. The arrogant bravado instantly evaporated. I could hear her rapid, shallow breathing. Blair was vain, and she was heavily spoiled, but she was not a hardened criminal mastermind. She stammered, her voice suddenly high-pitched and trembling. She swore she did not know where the startup capital came from. She said their father told her it was a personal business loan from his own accounts. Then, in her panic, she revealed the final missing link. She told me that 4 months ago, a private courier had arrived at the house with a large package of banking documents. Pamela had instructed Blair to sign the delivery receipt. Blair admitted, her voice dropping to a terrified whisper, that the package was explicitly addressed to Treasurer Millie Green. Blair assumed I had finally stopped being difficult and had quietly accepted the role to help the family. I ended the call and tossed my phone onto the couch. A profound, exhausted sorrow washed over me, replacing the sharp sting of betrayal. Blair was undoubtedly self-absorbed, and she was more than happy to blindly accept thousands of dollars without ever asking hard questions. But she was not the architect of this fraud. She was just another gear functioning exactly as designed within our parents' corrupt machinery. They fed her ego to keep her compliant, just as they tried to starve my confidence to keep me controllable. My parents had built an entire empire on the concept of family values, yet they were perfectly willing to let one daughter face federal prison time just to ensure the other daughter could keep a luxury storefront. The moral rot went all the way down to the foundation. There was nothing left to save, and there was absolutely nothing left to negotiate. I instituted a complete and absolute communication lockdown. I changed the security settings on my cell phone so that any incoming call from my mother or father was routed immediately to a silent voicemail. I flatly refused to engage in their preferred method of verbal warfare, where my father could shout over me and my mother could weaponize her tears. From that moment forward, every single piece of communication had to be a text message or a written email, meticulously preserved and time-stamped in the digital cloud. At first, the silence in my apartment was agonizing. For 3 decades, my default biological response to their displeasure was a frantic, desperate attempt to fix the situation, to apologize endlessly, and to mold myself back into the exact shape they demanded. Learning to sit still with the crushing weight of their manufactured disappointment, without lifting a finger to alleviate it, was the hardest psychological work I had ever done. It was far more exhausting than picking up double shifts at Redline Medical Transit. I was working 60 hours a week, coordinating emergency oxygen deliveries and complex dialysis transports, saving every spare dollar just to replace the venue and catering deposits my mother had spitefully canceled. Earning the cash was just basic physical fatigue. Learning to kill the deeply ingrained guilt of being a disobedient daughter was a brutal, daily war within my own mind. But with every unanswered phone call, the invisible strings they had permanently attached to my conscience began to fray and finally snap. Nolan and I completely abandoned the upscale, perfectly manicured aesthetic my parents had originally dictated for the event. We found a small, family-owned property on the edge of the county called Willow Creek Orchard. The owners had painstakingly converted a massive, weathered wooden barn into a breathtaking event space. It smelled of aged cedar, dried lavender, and genuine, lived-in warmth. It was not a sterile, exclusive country club, but it felt entirely like us. Without Pamela's endless financial threats hanging over my head, the wedding planning suddenly transitioned into a labor of profound love. We spent a Sunday morning at the local farmers market, buying galvanized metal buckets filled with wild sunflowers, deep red dahlias, and overgrown ferns for a fraction of the cost of a high-end commercial florist. Our friends rallied around us in ways that left me speechless. They loaned us miles of warm yellow string lights and boxes of mismatched vintage glassware. We were building something raw, beautiful, and authentic with our own bare hands, completely free from the suffocating, transactional nature of the Green family empire. While we built a joyous celebration by day, we built a fortified bunker by night. Nolan's mother, Evelyn, practically moved into our apartment. She transformed our tiny laminate dining table into a legitimate legal command center. Evelyn did not operate on sentiment or emotion. She operated exclusively on cold, hard data. She brought over a heavy-duty label maker, thick plastic binders, and bright, color-coded index tabs. She sat beside Nolan, and together they cataloged every single piece of evidence we had gathered, treating my family drama exactly like a federal court docket. They placed the forged state compliance form in a clear protective sleeve. They printed the aggressive text messages demanding I sign the backdated papers. They filed the 2 conflicting sets of accounting ledgers side by side, highlighting the exact dates and the exact dollar amounts where the charitable funds were illegally diverted to pay my father's corporate tax liens and my sister's commercial rent. Evelyn organized everything in strict chronological order. She built a timeline so airtight and undeniable that no amount of smooth, charismatic talking from Russell Greene could ever dismantle it. It was a defensive weapon forged purely out of facts, ready to be deployed the exact second they tried to publicly execute my character. We were not entirely isolated on the social front, either. Aunt May proved to be an absolute master of quiet, strategic diplomacy. While she explicitly chose not to reveal the explosive details of the financial fraud to the extended family over the phone, she methodically called the aunts, uncles, and cousins who were still sitting cautiously on the fence. She casually and warmly suggested that they should perhaps wait to hear both sides of the story before completely writing me off. She gently reminded them of my 31 years of quiet, steady reliability, heavily contrasting it with my parents' sudden, highly theatrical claims of my supposed mental instability. She planted necessary seeds of rational doubt, ensuring that if the worst-case scenario happened at the ceremony, the audience would not be entirely hostile toward me. The final attempt at coercion arrived exactly 2 weeks before the ceremony. I was sitting on the living room rug, addressing plain white envelopes, when a text message from my father illuminated my screen. It was short, completely devoid of any parental affection, and read exactly like a hostile corporate negotiation. He wrote that if I signed the paperwork immediately and agreed to change the date of my post-wedding gala to accommodate their schedule, my mother and he would attend the ceremony as if nothing had ever happened. They were generously offering me a pardon for a crime I did not commit, completely contingent on my active participation in their impending felony. I looked at the glowing words. A month ago, a message exactly like that would have sent me into a violent spiral of panic and anxiety. Now, looking at the screen, I felt absolutely nothing. The fear was entirely gone. I did not type out a long, emotional explanation begging for their understanding. I did not accuse them of theft over a text message. I simply replied with a single, definitive sentence. I wrote that I would not sign the backdated papers and I would not change my wedding date. Then, I placed the phone face down on the carpet and calmly went back to writing addresses. Nolan watched me set the phone aside from across the room. He stood up, walked over to a stack of cardboard boxes in the corner, and pulled out a high-definition digital projector and a tightly rolled canvas screen. He had quietly borrowed the expensive equipment from the title company's main conference room. He set the heavy projector down on the coffee table and looked at me with a calm, steely determination. He suggested that we set up a discrete projection system at the back of the barn during the reception. He called it an insurance policy. He promised me, his voice low and incredibly steady, that we would only plug it in and use it if my parents actually showed up and attempted to hijack the narrative. If they tried to play the role of the heartbroken, victimized parents in front of our guests, we would be ready. It was a loaded truth, kept safely out of sight, but entirely ready to fire if they forced our hand. Later that night, while Nolan was out picking up dinner, I walked into our cramped spare bedroom. Hanging quietly on the back of the closet door was my wedding dress. It was not the exorbitant, heavily beaded designer gown my mother had originally picked out and then abruptly canceled. It was a simple, elegant ivory sheath I had found on a clearance rack at a small boutique 2 towns over. It cost less than $500. I slipped it over my head and reached back to pull the zipper up. I stood in front of the cheap, full-length mirror leaning against the painted wall. The soft fabric fell perfectly around me. There were no heavy, suffocating layers pulling me down to the floor. I looked directly at my reflection, tracing the calm, steady lines of my own face. For the first time in my entire life, I was standing in a room, wearing a dress, and making a monumental life choice that required absolutely zero approval from Pamela and Russell Green. I was no longer the invisible, compliant daughter silently managing the background logistics of their perfect public image. I was finally building my own life, standing firmly on my own 2 feet, and I was entirely prepared to defend it. The morning of the wedding arrived with a crisp, completely cloudless sky. I woke up at 6 o'clock in the morning, the early light filtering through the thin blinds of my bedroom. My first instinct, trained by 3 decades of conditioning, was to reach for my cell phone on the nightstand. I unlocked the screen. The notification center was entirely blank where my parents were concerned. There were no last-minute apologies, no demands, and no passive-aggressive guilt trips. The digital silence was absolute. Instead, there was a warm, encouraging message from Aunt May confirming she was 20 minutes away, and a flurry of texts from my bridesmaids, who were already downstairs brewing a massive pot of coffee. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the meadow at Willow Creek Orchard had been transformed into a sanctuary. The late October sun cast a thick golden hue over the rows of wooden folding chairs and the makeshift altar framed by ancient, sprawling oak branches. It was breathtakingly beautiful, built entirely on the foundation of genuine friendship rather than a heavy, transactional checkbook. Yet, as the guests began to arrive and take their seats, the crisp autumn air carried a distinct, chilling undercurrent. I stood out of sight inside the converted bridal suite, looking out the window, watching my extended family mingle. The whispers were undeniable. Groups of aunts and second cousins huddled together, their heads leaning close, casting frequent sympathetic glances toward the empty front row reserved for the bride's family. They were whispering the exact narrative my parents had carefully planted. They were murmuring about the ungrateful, unhinged daughter who had cruelly banned her devoted parents from the most important day of her life. The social pressure was a heavy, invisible blanket draped over the entire congregation. Then, the acoustic guitarist began to play the processional melody. The wooden doors of the suite swung open, and I stepped out onto the long, grass-covered aisle. Traditionally, this is the exact moment the father of the bride steps forward to offer his arm, transferring ownership of his daughter to another man. I stood at the beginning of the path entirely alone. The visual impact of my solitary figure caused a sharp, collective intake of breath from the seated guests. My hands gripped my bouquet of wild dahlias so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. Walking down that aisle alone was the most profound, agonizing pain I had ever experienced. It was the public death of the fantasy that I had a father who loved me enough to put aside his own ego. But with every single step I took toward the altar, the crushing weight on my chest began to evaporate. The pain rapidly transformed into the most intoxicating, blinding sense of liberation. I was not being given away by a man who viewed me as a disposable asset. I was walking myself into my own future. Waiting at the end of that long walk was Nolan. He looked incredibly handsome in his tailored suit, but his posture was unlike a typical, overwhelmed groom. He was entirely focused, projecting an aura of absolute hyper-vigilant calm. His eyes locked onto mine, offering a steady, unwavering anchor, but his peripheral vision constantly scanned the perimeter of the orchard. He was fiercely present in the sacredness of our vows, yet he stood with the quiet, coiled energy of a man anticipating an ambush. He slipped the gold band onto my finger, his voice resonating with deep, unshakable certainty, promising to protect our peace against any threat. The ceremony concluded beautifully. As we walked back up the aisle together as husband and wife, the tension among the guests seemed to dissipate. The transition into the evening reception felt like a collective exhale. We moved into the warmly lit, cavernous wooden barn. The string lights we had hung by hand cast a soft, romantic glow over the tables. Laughter echoed off the cedar walls. Wine glasses clinked in genuine celebration, and the heavy burden of my family's drama felt a million miles away. As the clock approached 7 in the evening, the caterers began bringing out the dinner service. I sat beside Nolan at the head table, taking my very first bite of food all day, allowing myself to finally believe that we had survived. I actually thought my parents had chosen to stay home and save face. I was completely wrong. The crunching sound of heavy tires rolling over the gravel driveway cut through the gentle background music. The barn doors were wide open to the cool night air, offering everyone inside a clear, unobstructed view of the entrance. A pristine, oversized black sport utility vehicle crept forward at an agonizingly slow pace. It did not park in the designated overflow lot hidden behind the trees. It pulled directly up to the main entrance of the barn, stopping right where the light spilled out onto the grass. The vehicle was positioned perfectly, a deliberate, calculated maneuver designed to capture the attention of every single person holding a fork inside that room. The chatter instantly died down. 200 heads turned simultaneously. The heavy doors of the vehicle opened. Russell and Pamela Green stepped out into the crisp evening air. They were dressed impeccably, wearing the solemn, dignified expressions of martyrs walking into the lion's den. Pamela did not hesitate. She walked straight into the center of the reception floor, completely bypassing the guest book and the seating chart. She locked eyes with me from across the room and practically ran toward the head table. Before I could even stand up or process the sudden intrusion, she threw her arms around my neck, pulling me into a crushing, theatrical embrace in front of dozens of silent, staring relatives. Right on cue, her voice broke. She produced a flawless, trembling sob that echoed loudly in the cavernous space.
Oh,
My beautiful girl, Pamela cried out, ensuring her voice carried to the very back tables. I do not care what was said. I do not care how much you wanted to push us away. I could not miss this. No matter what you do, no matter how confused you are right now, I am still your mother, and I will always forgive you. It was a breathtaking performance. To the uninformed guests, it looked like the ultimate display of unconditional, heroic parental love overcoming a bitter, rebellious child. She was publicly absolving me of a sin she had entirely fabricated. While Pamela executed her emotional theater, Russell walked directly up to Nolan. My father extended a firm, masculine hand, his face set in a look of stoic, enduring grace. He shook Nolan's hand vigorously, clapping him warmly on the shoulder. He acted as if the ruthless phone calls, the canceled vendor deposits, and the vicious financial threats had never existed. He was the benevolent patriarch, gracefully welcoming a new son into the fold, instantly creating the illusion of a miraculous, last-minute family reconciliation. I stood frozen in my mother's suffocating grip, the scent of her expensive perfume making me nauseous. The guests around us began to smile, a few even wiping away sympathetic tears, entirely convinced by the beautiful lie unfolding in front of them. My mother pulled back, holding my face in her hands, waiting for me to break down, apologize, and accept my designated role in her script. Instead of looking at her, I looked over her shoulder. I caught Nolan's eye. Nolan did not look angry. He did not look surprised. He stood perfectly still, his hands resting casually at his sides, watching my parents execute the exact maneuver he had predicted weeks ago. He caught my gaze through the crowd. Very slowly, he gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. The safety was off. My parents had driven their luxury vehicle right through the front gates, completely convinced they were stepping onto a stage perfectly designed for their ultimate triumph. They had no idea they had just walked through the front door of their own execution. The trap was heavily set, the evidence was loaded, and the projector was waiting patiently in the dark. The dinner service concluded with the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain plates, a gentle rhythm that completely masked the racing of my heart. The best man, a childhood friend of Nolan's, had just finished a genuinely funny, heartwarming toast that brought a wave of bright laughter to the barn. The tension my parents had dragged into the room seemed to momentarily recede into the shadows. My mother was seated at a table near the front, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a linen napkin, continuing her flawless portrayal of the emotionally overwhelmed, deeply loving matriarch. My father sat beside her, sipping his bourbon, projecting the relaxed aura of a man who had successfully re-established his rightful dominance over his family. They believed the storm had passed. They believed their mere physical presence had instantly rewritten reality. Then, Nolan stood up. He did not tap his glass with a knife. He simply walked around the edge of the head table and gently took the wireless microphone from the metal stand. He stood squarely in the center of the dance floor, directly under the warm glow of the overhead string lights. The easy, relaxed smile he wore during the previous toasts completely vanished, replaced by an expression of sharp, unbreakable resolve. He looked out over the sea of faces, his gaze briefly meeting mine before turning toward the crowd. I want to sincerely thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate with us, Nolan began, his voice echoing cleanly through the massive wooden barn. It was a perfectly measured, even tone. Your support means absolutely everything to Millie and me. We especially want to thank those of you who chose to show up today, even when the truth you were being told was not entirely comfortable to hear. A sudden, highly palpable shift occurred in the room. The relaxed posture of the guests stiffened. A few people shifted uneasily in their wooden folding chairs. At the front table, my father lowered his bourbon glass to the tablecloth with a slow, deliberate motion. Over the past 5 weeks, Nolan continued, stepping slightly closer to the tables where the Green family relatives were seated. A very specific, highly coordinated story has been circulating through this town. Many of you were told that Millie, out of some sudden, inexplicable sense of arrogance, explicitly banned her own parents from attending her wedding. You were told she was ashamed of her roots. You were told she was acting cruelly. The silence in the barn became absolute. It was so quiet, I could hear the faint rustling of the wind outside the open doors. I need to make one thing perfectly, undeniably clear before we go any further, Nolan stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. Millie never uninvited her parents. She never asked them to stay away. Pamela and Russell Green explicitly announced they were boycotting this wedding. They withdrew their presents, and they withdrew their financial deposits, as a calculated, coercive tactic to force Millie into signing a highly suspicious set of financial documents against her will. The collective gasp from the audience was instantaneous. Aunt May, sitting 2 tables away, sat up entirely straight, her eyes locking onto my parents. My mother shot up from her chair as if the seat had suddenly caught fire. Her face, previously arranged in a mask of weeping joy, twisted into a mask of pure, indignant fury. "How dare you!" Pamela shrieked, her voice cracking with manufactured outrage. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Nolan. "How absolutely dare you use my daughter's wedding day to humiliate her elders? We came here to support her. We came here to forgive her. And you are using this beautiful evening to spread vicious, unhinged lies because you want to isolate her from her family." She turned to the crowd, placing a hand over her heart, violently trying to swing the pendulum of public sympathy back to her side. I watched several relatives exchange highly uncertain glances. The dramatic display was powerful, and my mother had decades of practice manipulating these exact people. Nolan did not raise his voice to shout over her. He did not engage in a heated, emotional argument. He simply reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his cell phone. "I am not going to argue with you, Pamela," Nolan said evenly. He walked over to the soundboard positioned near the corner of the dance floor. He plugged a single auxiliary cable into the headphone jack of his device. He tapped the screen once. Suddenly, my mother's voice blasted through the massive, high-fidelity speakers positioned around the perimeter of the barn. It was not the shrieking defensive tone she was currently using. It was the sickeningly sweet, conspiratorial whisper she had used when she called Nolan's mother just days ago. "Evelyn, dear." The recorded voice of Pamela cooed through the speakers, filling every corner of the silent room. "I am just calling because Russell and I are terribly worried about Millie. She is going through some sort of severe emotional crisis. She is completely unbalanced right now. We are stepping back from the wedding because we are terrified she might cause a massive public scandal. We just want to make sure Nolan knows what he is getting into." The recording clicked off. Nolan unplugged the cable. The atmospheric pressure inside the room completely inverted. The sympathetic glances aimed at my mother instantly evaporated, replaced by wide, horrified stares. The guests were looking at a woman who had just been caught, in her own recorded words, actively trying to convince her future mother-in-law that her own daughter was mentally unstable. The sheer, calculated malice of the phone call stripped away Pamela's entire carefully constructed facade in a matter of 10 seconds. My father stood up, his large frame blocking my mother from the crowd's view. His face was a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. The benevolent patriarch routine was completely dead. "This reception is over," Russell bellowed, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. He grabbed Pamela's arm roughly. "We are leaving right now. I will not sit here and let some arrogant kid disrespect my wife and tear my family apart." "You are not leaving yet, Russell," Nolan commanded, his voice suddenly dropping into a register of pure steel. "Because the guests need to see exactly what you were trying to force Millie to sign while you were simultaneously telling the town she was losing her mind." Nolan clicked a small remote control in his hand. Directly behind the head table, a massive, bright rectangle of light illuminated the canvas screen we had hidden against the cedar wall. The high-definition projector cast an image so large and crisp that even the guests sitting at the absolute back of the barn could read the black text clearly. It was the state compliance document, the public registry form for the June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship. Nolan used a red digital laser pointer to circle the critical section of the document. The bright red dot danced around the words printed in black ink. "This is an official state filing submitted just a few weeks ago," Nolan announced to the stunned crowd. "Right there, listed as the sole treasurer of the foundation, is Millie's name. And right next to it are the initials M and G, supposedly confirming her acceptance of the financial bylaws." The crowd stared at the massive projection. "Millie did not sign that paper," Nolan continued, his voice echoing relentlessly. "She has never attended a board meeting. She has never seen a ledger. Someone forged her initials on an official government document." "It is a clerical mistake," Pamela yelled frantically, her voice pitching into a panicked screech. She was physically retreating, stepping backward toward the open barn doors. "It is merely a simple administrative error. The accountant filed the wrong draft." "Turn that machine off right now," Russell demanded, stepping toward Nolan with his fists clenched tightly at his sides. "This is a private internal family matter. It has absolutely nothing to do with anyone in this room. It stopped being an internal family matter the second you decided to wage a public war against your daughter to cover your own tracks," Nolan fired back, standing his ground entirely. "If this was just a simple administrative error, Russell, you would not have spent the last 5 consecutive weeks boycotting this wedding. You would not have called her employer to imply she was mentally unfit for her job. And you certainly would not have relentlessly harassed her, day and night, demanding she sign a backdated indemnity clause to legally bind her to a position she never held." The barn was dead silent. The truth hung in the air, massive and undeniable, pinning my parents to the floor under the weight of their own lies. Nolan lowered the laser pointer. He looked directly at my father, his eyes completely devoid of any mercy. "That is only the first layer," Nolan said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet calm that somehow carried over the complete silence of the room. "Now I will show everyone exactly why they needed Millie's name on that paper, right before Monday's audit." Nolan pressed the button on his remote control. The image on the massive canvas screen shifted, displaying a painstakingly constructed side-by-side timeline. On the left side of the screen were the dates and amounts of generous donations pouring into the June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship from well-meaning community members. On the right side were the exact corresponding dates of massive financial withdrawals. Nolan directed his red laser pointer to a specific block of text. He explained that a $12,000 withdrawal, boldly labeled in the public ledger as an emergency youth apprenticeship grant, was transferred on the exact same day that a $12,000 payment was made to secure a 6-month commercial lease for Blair's upscale styling boutique. He moved the pointer down. He highlighted an $8,000 withdrawal categorized as vocational equipment, which perfectly matched a payment made to the State Department of Revenue to clear Russell's delinquent corporate tax liens. Another $5,000 line item covered personal public relations consulting fees for Pamela. A collective murmur of horror rippled through the seated guests. Aunt May covered her mouth with both hands. Nolan clicked the remote again. The screen filled with giant, undeniable screenshots of my mother's text messages and emails from the past 5 weeks. The messages aggressively demanded that I sign the backdated executive board paperwork. Nolan stated clearly that my parents had panicked because they knew a mandatory state audit was scheduled for the Monday following our wedding. They desperately needed my signature on a backdated document to legally prove I was the acting treasurer during the exact time frame when the funds were systematically looted. They needed a scapegoat to take the federal charges. Then, Nolan displayed the final, most devastating piece of evidence. It was the canceled digital receipt from our original wedding florist. Nolan told the crowd that Pamela Green did not generously offer to pay the $2,000 floral deposit out of the kindness of her heart. He pointed to the payment source on the receipt. It clearly read June Green Memorial Trade Scholarship. He explained that my parents deliberately used stolen charity funds to pay for my wedding services. They did this to create a permanent, undeniable paper trail that falsely proved the acting treasurer, Millie Green, was using the foundation account for her own personal benefit. They were actively framing me for embezzlement so perfectly that no jury would ever doubt it. The absolute silence in the barn shattered as Russell Green completely lost his mind. "You ungrateful traitor!" my father roared, his massive fists clenched at his sides. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. The benevolent, wounded patriarch mask completely dissolved, revealing the ruthless, controlling tyrant underneath. He lunged a step forward, screaming that I was destroying the family name and that I owed them everything. By screaming the word traitor, he inadvertently confessed to the entire room that his motive was absolute control, not moral principle. Seeing her husband lose his grip on the narrative, Pamela completely abandoned her self-righteous anger. She rushed toward me, her perfectly styled hair falling out of place, her hands grasping wildly at my arms. She dropped her voice into a frantic, desperate whisper, begging me to turn the projector off, pleading that we could fix this privately, promising me anything I wanted if I just stopped embarrassing them. But she was too late. The relatives sitting at the front tables heard every single desperate, guilty word. They finally understood that the 5-week wedding boycott was never about teaching me humility. It was a panicked, desperate campaign to force me into becoming their human shield. Suddenly, the sound of a chair scraping loudly against the wooden floorboards echoed through the room. Blair stood up. My younger sister looked entirely pale, her hands trembling violently as she clutched her expensive silk evening gown. She did not look at our parents. She looked directly at me. With a wavering, tearful voice, Blair admitted to the entire room that 4 months ago, she had personally signed for a secure courier package containing bank ledger documents explicitly addressed to Treasurer Millie Green. She confessed that she handed those documents to our mother and never asked a single question, willfully ignoring the obvious fraud because she wanted to keep the funding for her boutique. The crowd let out a collective gasp. It was a heartbreaking twist. People were furious at her complicity, yet they pitied the spoiled, blind dependent she had been raised to be. I finally stepped forward. I did not scream at my parents. I did not hurl insults, and I did not cry. My voice was calm, clear, and utterly resolute. I told my mother and father that this wedding was a celebration of honesty and partnership. I stated that I refused to be the designated dumping ground for their crimes anymore. I told them I would not take the fall for their theft, and that from this exact second forward, everything regarding the June Green charity would be handled exclusively through the legal system. Russell grabbed Pamela by the arm, dragging her away from me. They turned and practically ran out of the barn, their faces flushed with absolute humiliation, stumbling through the heavy wooden doors and out into the dark, cold night. The sound of their heavy sport utility vehicle speeding recklessly down the gravel driveway faded into the distance. The barn was filled with a stunned, heavy silence. People stared at me, their eyes wide with shock and profound apologies. I looked at Nolan. He calmly pressed the power button on the projector remote. The massive screen went entirely black. He walked over to the soundboard and gave a sharp nod to the DJ we had hired. A split second later, an upbeat, joyful song blasted through the speakers, instantly shattering the heavy tension in the room. I grabbed my husband's hand and pulled him onto the center of the dance floor. I was absolutely determined not to let Russell and Pamela Green steal the final chapter of my wedding day. Slowly, hesitantly at first, my true friends and the relatives who actually loved me began to join us. We danced until our feet ached, reclaiming the joy they had tried so hard to destroy. The real world crashed down less than 48 hours later. Bright and early on Monday morning, I walked into the state charity regulator's office and formally submitted a massive binder containing the dual ledgers, the forged signature documents, and the explosive florist invoice. By noon, I was sitting in the polished office of a civil attorney, officially drafting a ruthless cease and desist letter demanding my parents completely remove my name from all foundation registries due to identity theft. Over the next few weeks, the fallout was spectacular. The state audit triggered a massive criminal investigation. Several relatives who had blindly believed my parents called me in tears, begging for my forgiveness. I accepted their apologies, but I kept them at a very healthy distance. Other relatives, the ones too proud to admit they were wrong, simply vanished into the background, and I let them go without a fight. I no longer needed their validation. I no longer needed my parents to tell me I was a good person. I had built a beautiful, honest life entirely on my own terms, and no one would ever force me into the shadows again. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting the like button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.